and welcome to First Look. My name's Carl and it's good to have you with us this week for our Bible study and time of sharing together. We're diving in with a really interesting and challenging passage, the parable of the Wedding Banquet, which you can find at Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 to 14. Before we get started, you might like to download the sheet for this week. It has the reading on it and reference to a couple of other passages you might find helpful and the questions that we'll be thinking about later on. So as I say, we're really diving in at the deep end with this particular passage. We're in the story of Holy Week to set the scene. Jesus has arrived in the temple in Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. He's overturned the tables in the temple with all the commotion and controversy that caused. And he's now back the day later, this is the Monday of Holy Week, teaching in the temple and attracting large numbers of people to hear what he's got to say. That has in turn incurred the wrath of the temple authorities, the temple establishment, and they've come out and they've said to Jesus, by what authority are you doing these things? What right have you got to be saying and doing this stuff? And Jesus has been answering them with a set of parables. So we've had in previous weeks in the lectionary the parable of the two sons, last week the parable of the vineyard owner and the wicked tenants, and this week we have the third and final one of these parables, the parable of the wedding banquet. And note that these parables are addressed to the religious leaders of Israel. So this isn't a conflict with the people of Israel as a whole, this is a conflict with the temple establishment. And that's quite important because sometimes this passage has been ripped out of its context and used to justify anti-Semitic preaching and something called supersessionism, which is the belief that the church has basically supplanted and erased the people of Israel. As we're going to see, this is a difficult passage to pin down, but that's definitely not what's going on here. So it's quite difficult to know what to make of this text. I looked at a range of commentaries when I was getting this video ready. And some of them are really definite, that this is about one very clear thing, like God's judgment, for example, and the need for standards of holiness. And at the other extreme, there were commentators saying there's no practical lesson that we can take away from this passage. So it can kind of feel a bit bewildering. If you imagine it being a bit like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube, my Rubik's Cube here, then I suppose it's like saying there's so many different possible combinations and ways of doing things and methods you could follow that we might not know where to start. But I think we can say some helpful things about it. So the people that are present in this scene, we've got the chief priests and the elders, and we know some Pharisees from what we see in Matthew 21 verse 45, gathered in the temple courtyard to hear Jesus along with the crowds. And it's important to keep in mind as well that the Gospel of Matthew was almost certainly written after the event that really had the most influence on the Jewish people in that time, which was the destruction of Jerusalem and in particular its temple in the year 70. That had a massive effect in terms of pushing people to then think, well, what does it mean to be the people of God if the centre of our religious life has been decimated? And Matthew's community are living in the aftermath of that. Still part of the synagogues at that time, the church hadn't kind of broken away, but wrestling with what that meant, and in particular what it meant to be faithful to the risen Jesus in that context. And the type of literature this week is, obviously it's a parable, it's one of Jesus's great stories. And it has a semi-parallel in Luke's Gospel in chapter 14, verses 15 to 24, which is mentioned on your sheet. But that's a much easier text to preach on. It doesn't have some of these really violent and really difficult elements that Matthew's reading has. Also, it's useful to keep in mind, again on the sheet, Isaiah chapter 26, verses 1 to 9, which is about another banquet that reveals God's abundant care. So all of that's kind of in the background, I think, with this reading. But I suspect actually what may have happened is either the parables came from two different sources, it was a story of a wedding banquet Jesus told more than once, or Luke has kind of removed the difficult stuff from Matthew's version and put it in his gospel later on, used it for a different purpose. Either of those kind of makes sense to me. So, diving into the actual content of the text, we're looking at a wedding banquet in honour of the king's son, and it's generally assumed that the son in this question is representing Jesus as God's son and Israel's Messiah, and also as the church's bridegroom. That's all imagery that's used for who Jesus is. And if you were given an invitation to a royal banquet, a chance for some really luxurious feasting and partying, and all bought and paid for, as it were, you probably would clear your diary out and make time for that royal summons. But the first weird thing that happens in this parable in verse 3 is that nobody accepts that invitation. Now, some commentators argue that what's going on here is a kind of honour and shame dynamic, and the shame that the king would have experienced as a result of that is what drives him to send the servants out to go out to those people who were invited and say, look, this is going to be amazing, you really want to be there. Other commentators say that apparently sending out a double invitation like that to a party and perhaps being turned down the first time wasn't unusual. People wanted to see who else was going and see if the arrangements were to their satisfaction. So right from the beginning, we're not quite sure what's going on. But we do know that the king sends out the servants a second time and says, this is going to be great. But we also know in verse 5 that some of them basically say, I'm too busy with my everyday stuff, I've got things to do. And then in verse 6, and quite abruptly, and for no really obvious reason, it turns violent. Some of those people turn on the servants and they attack them and they kill them. It's really quite brutal. Some suggest that the servants symbolise the prophets, the Hebrew prophets, and maybe John the Baptist as well. Others suggest that they're members of Matthew's Christian community who were beginning to get a hard time in the synagogues. Though, as I say, I'm not sure about that really, because the church hadn't broken away from the synagogue quite at that point. But either way, if these people are symbolic of those who were being killed, it would make sense that they were the prophets, because most of those did meet a rather sticky end. The king responds in kind to the violence inflicted on the servants. Maybe because he'd lost patience by that point, maybe because that incident would have brought great shame and he had to redress his honour in some way. But either way, the city is left smouldering and burning as a result of the king's retaliation. So we may want to ask ourselves, do we really want to associate that king figure with God, with that kind of retaliation? It's a thought for later on, we'll come back to in the questions. The one detail that the variety of commentaries I looked at in preparing for today do seem to agree on is that the smouldering city and the ruination of that does look to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70, which was interpreted by a lot of Christians as reflecting the failure to embrace Jesus and how he was trying to redefine and rejuvenate the people of Israel. So we have a situation where we've got a ruined city and the original guests have been killed, deemed unworthy, as verse 8 puts it. So what does the king do? Well, he decides, quite remarkably, to send out his servants, some more servants, and bring in all comers to come to the banquet instead, because apparently despite the ruination of the city, the food has been kept warm and it's all waiting and ready. So the servants go out and basically they round up anybody they can find, we're told, both the good and the bad, and bring them in for this wedding banquet. We don't know if the good and the bad, as it were, represent the kind of people that Jesus spent a lot of his time hanging around with, sinners and sex workers and so on, or whether, as one commentator suggested, they might actually represent the early Christian leaders being brought in that situation. Now, in the final part of the parable, in verses 11 to 14, we maybe get the most disturbing elements of all, that might cause us to kind of really puzzle over what we're doing with the Rubik's Cube. It feels like we've ended up with a kind of dystopian version of Mamma Mia going on in this incident, in that everybody who's come to the wedding has been kind of rounded up, shuffled in, whether they actually wanted to come or not. And there's one guy who is not wearing a proper wedding garment. And we find out in verses 11 to 14 that when the king goes and circulates with his guests, which kind of implies he sees them as equals, actually, which is interesting given that they were from the poorest parts of the city rather than the wealthy people he'd intended initially to invite. The king comes across this guy and says, "Friend, what are you doing here, basically? Why aren't you dressed properly?" And the man is speechless, has nothing to say to that, and then is cast out into the outer darkness, where in Matthew's wonderful phrase, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So verses 11 to 14 are perhaps the most difficult of the lot to grapple with. And there's a lot of speculation about who this man represents. Who was he? So some suggest, because the king refers to him as friend, that he could be Judas, because Jesus in the garden refers to Judas as friend, in Gethsemane that is, and says, do what you need to do, basically. Others suggest that this guy represents complacent members of Matthew's own community, who needed reminding that this king was no pushover and did have exacting standards. In a similar vein, some argue that this is to do with standards of righteousness, of holiness that were demanded in the life of the church. And others say that this is to do with people who were not doing good works. So they might have accepted Jesus in theory, but it wasn't actually making a practical difference to how they lived their lives. Others say that these are Jewish leaders who continue to refuse God's summons. And others suggest that they were basically people who had failed to come festively. This was the great Karl Barth's interpretation of this. That failing to come to a feast in festive mode was as much rejecting the invitation as those people who decided they were too busy and had more important things to do. So there's a lot to take in there, I appreciate. And it's a parable where even if we find one way of playing around with the Rubik's Cube and of processing the details that make sense to us, still kind of feels to me to be a bit extreme, really, in terms of the things that happen. It stretches credibility to the absolute limits. One other way of looking at this parable is a completely different reading of it that challenges some of the assumptions, like the assumption, for example, that the king is associated with God the Father. It's more of an attempt to read it from the margins, from a liberation perspective, rather than from the centre. And it suggests this parable may be less like Mamma Mia, albeit a dystopian version thereof, and perhaps a little bit more like the Hunger Games. That maybe it's a parable of protest, maybe it's a parable of resistance. So this reading, suggests that nobody wants to come to the banquet of the king because the king is a tyrant. And the wedding of his son reminds these people that there's no end to this oppressive dynasty in sight. This reading would suggest that the wealthier people were able to make excuses and get out of having to come to the banquet, but that the poorest felt they had maybe no choice but to resort to violence, hence the killing of the servants. And if you think about it, if the king might actually be someone more like the Roman emperor, and the son maybe symbolising his envoy, Pontius Pilate, who we know was in Jerusalem at the same time of Jesus in Holy Week because he wanted to keep order during the festival of Passover. Maybe this is all to do with wanting to reject the Romans and the kind of violent rebellion that we know went on in Jesus' day and which led them to eventually to destroy the temple in 70 AD. It was because they got fed up of putting down violent rebellion. So could that explain why things apparently escalate so rapidly? Could it further be that everybody who came to the wedding banquet was rounded up, whether they wanted to be there or not? But the guy who refused to wear the wedding garment was someone who was making a protest against this, was doing what we might now call non-violent direct action, is the only way he could say, look, I don't want to support this and I don't actually want to be here. And it's interesting that when Jesus is put on trial by those same religious leaders that he's having these disputes and arguments with in the temple courtyard, he himself keeps silent. He refuses to answer their questions. And we know that eventually he is cast out into the outer darkness. Golgotha was certainly a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth beyond the city. That's where Jesus was crucified. So that's potentially another way of reading it, which puts quite a different spin on the parable, but I think is an interesting one to keep in mind.